Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On a cold autumn evening in October 1986, the rural outskirts of Hwaseong, South Korea, seemed suspended in time. Rice fields stretched endlessly beneath a darkening sky, irrigation ditches reflected faint moonlight, and narrow dirt roads wound through farming villages where everyone knew one another's names. It was the kind of place where crime felt distant, something that happened in big cities and appeared briefly on television before being forgotten. That illusion shattered when the body of a young woman was discovered face down in a drainage ditch, her clothes disheveled, her hands bound behind her back. What initially appeared to be an isolated tragedy would soon reveal itself as the beginning of the most infamous and devastating criminal case in South Korean history, a case that would haunt the nation for more than 3 decades. The victim was 23-year-old Park Hyun-suk, a factory worker who had been walking home from a bus stop after her evening shift. She never made it. Her body bore signs of sexual assault and strangulation, and investigators noted a chilling detail that would later become tragically familiar. Her clothing had been carefully arranged near her body, almost deliberately placed. At the time, police had no reason to believe they were standing at the threshold of a nightmare that would claim multiple lives and expose deep flaws in South Korea's criminal justice system. Hwaseong in the late 1980s was undergoing rapid change. South Korea was industrializing at a breathtaking pace, and factories were springing up alongside traditional farmland. Young women from nearby towns and villages traveled daily to work in textile plants and electronics factories, often returning home late at night. Public transportation was limited, street lighting was poor, and many workers walked long distances alone along dark roads. It was an environment ripe for vulnerability, though no one could have imagined just how brutally that vulnerability would be exploited. When Park Hyun-suk's murder was reported, local police responded with urgency but little experience. Violent sexual crimes of this nature were rare in rural areas, and forensic resources were limited. Investigators canvassed the area, questioned nearby residents, and searched for witnesses who might have seen her walking home. There were none. No screams had been reported, no suspicious vehicles observed. The fields and ditches swallowed sound, and whatever happened to her had occurred in near total isolation. Then just 2 months later, it happened again. On December 16, 1986, the body of a 25-year-old woman named Won Jae-sun was found in a field less than 5 kilometers from the first crime scene. She, too, had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her hands were bound, her clothing arranged. The similarities were impossible to ignore. 2 young women, both attacked while walking alone at night, both murdered in the same manner, both left in rural areas where discovery would be delayed. The fear that gripped Hwaseong after the second murder was immediate and suffocating. Residents began locking their doors earlier. Parents waited anxiously for daughters to return home. Factory managers adjusted shifts where possible, and women started walking in groups or carrying makeshift weapons. Still, the sense of dread lingered. Someone was out there, someone familiar with the land, someone patient enough to wait in darkness. Police officially acknowledged the possibility of a serial offender, a term that was still relatively new in South Korea at the time. The country had little precedent for serial sexual homicide, and profiling techniques were virtually non-existent. Investigators relied heavily on confessions, witness statements, and circumstantial evidence. Under immense pressure to reassure the public, police ramped up patrols, set up checkpoints, and questioned hundreds of men in the area, focusing especially on those with prior criminal records. Despite these efforts, the killings continued. In January 1987, a 21-year-old university student named Kim Mi-suk was found murdered near a drainage canal. Her body showed the same signs. In May, another victim. Then another. Each time the method was consistent, the locations eerily similar, the timing often coinciding with rainy nights when visibility was low and few people were outside. The killer seemed to understand patterns, both human and environmental. He struck when conditions favored him and vanished without leaving obvious traces. By the end of 1987, 5 women had been murdered in and around Hwaseong under nearly identical circumstances. The national media descended on the region, and the case became a fixture on evening news broadcasts. Headlines screamed about a phantom killer and a devil in the fields. Fear spread beyond Hwaseong, reaching nearby cities and even Seoul. Women across the country altered their routines, and the crimes began to symbolize a deeper anxiety about safety during a time of rapid social change. The South Korean government responded by mobilizing an unprecedented investigative effort. At its peak, more than 2 million police officers would be involved in some capacity over the course of the investigation, making it one of the largest manhunts in the nation's history. Thousands of suspects were questioned. Men were asked to provide hair samples, handwriting samples, and alibis. Some were interrogated repeatedly, subjected to intense psychological pressure. The desperation to catch the killer grew with every new victim. Yet for all the manpower and urgency, progress was elusive. The forensic limitations of the era proved devastating. DNA technology was in its infancy and unavailable to South Korean investigators. Evidence was often mishandled or degraded. Crime scenes were contaminated by large numbers of officers and onlookers. Critical details were lost, misinterpreted, or ignored. In later years, these failures would be scrutinized mercilessly, but at the time, they were simply part of a system unprepared for the horror it faced. As the murders continued into 1988 and 1989, the pattern began to show subtle variations. Some victims were older, some younger. One was a teenager. Another was attacked inside her home, suggesting the killer was becoming bolder, more confident. In one particularly disturbing case, a woman survived the attack, managing to escape and provide a description of her assailant. She described a man of average height, calm in demeanor, speaking softly, even politely. He did not appear drunk or enraged. He appeared controlled. That detail unsettled investigators. This was not a crime of sudden passion. This was someone methodical, someone who planned. Public frustration with the police reached a boiling point when an innocent man was arrested, charged, and convicted for one of the murders based largely on a coerced confession. Under intense interrogation, the suspect confessed to a crime he did not commit, a confession that would later unravel in horrifying fashion. At the time, however, authorities declared the case solved, eager to restore public confidence. But the killings did not stop. Another body was found. Then another. The truth was undeniable. The real killer was still free. Families of the victims lived in a constant state of grief and rage. Mothers spoke openly about their fear every time a daughter stepped outside. Fathers patrolled neighborhoods at night with flashlights and farming tools. Community trust eroded as suspicion crept into everyday interactions. Anyone could be the killer: a neighbor, a coworker, a man passing quietly in the rain. By 1991, after 10 confirmed murders, the killings suddenly stopped. No arrest, no explanation, just silence. For years, the Hwaseong murders remained an open wound in South Korean society. The case went cold, but it never faded. It became the subject of books, documentaries, and whispered conversations. Police officers who had worked the case were haunted by what they had seen and by what they had failed to prevent. The wrongfully convicted man remained in prison, his life stolen by a system desperate for closure. Time passed. South Korea changed. Democracy strengthened. Technology advanced. DNA analysis became routine. Yet the Hwasong killer remained a ghost, his identity unknown, his motives unexplained. Until decades later, when a single technological breakthrough would reopen the case and force the nation to confront a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. But before that truth emerged, before the name of the killer would finally be spoken, there was a long and painful reckoning still to come. One that would expose systemic abuse, institutional failure, and the devastating human cost of getting justice wrong. And that reckoning was only just beginning. As the murders stretched into the late 1980s, the pressure on South Korean law enforcement became unbearable. The country was preparing to host the 1988 Seoul Olympics, an event meant to showcase South Korea's progress, safety, and modernity to the world. The existence of a serial killer operating freely in a rural province threatened that image. Behind closed doors, police commanders were urged to produce results, any results, that would reassure the public and demonstrate control. This pressure filtered down to the detectives on the ground, many of whom were exhausted, undertrained, and traumatized by the scenes they had witnessed. Some had responded to multiple crime scenes, each one reinforcing the sense that they were always arriving too late. Each new victim brought another round of scrutiny, another wave of media criticism, another reminder that failure was no longer an option. In this environment, the investigation began to drift away from evidence and toward desperation. In 1989, police focused their attention on a young factory worker named Yoon Seong-yo. He was socially awkward, quiet, and lived near one of the crime scenes. He had a prior conviction for theft, a fact that immediately raised suspicion in the eyes of investigators. There was no physical evidence tying him to the murders. No witnesses placed him at the scenes. No forensic material linked him to the victims, but he fit what police believed a criminal should look like. Yoon was taken into custody and interrogated for days. Later court records and testimony would reveal that these interrogations were brutal. He was beaten, deprived of sleep, threatened, and coerced. Investigators fed him details of the crime and demanded he repeat them back. Eventually, broken and terrified, Yoon confessed to the murder of one victim. The confession was inconsistent and contradicted known facts, but it was enough. In November 1989, Yoon was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, later reduced to 20 years. Police declared partial victory. One murder had been solved. Public confidence wavered but did not fully collapse. For officials, this conviction provided breathing room, but reality refused to cooperate. In April 1991, the final known Hwasong murder occurred. A 69-year-old woman was raped and strangled in her home, her body discovered days later. The crime bore unmistakable similarities to the earlier killings. The same bindings, the same method, the same calculated cruelty. Yoon Seong-yo was already in prison when this murder happened. The implications were devastating. Quietly, investigators understood what this meant. The real killer had never been caught. The man sitting in prison was innocent. The system had failed on every level imaginable. Rather than publicly acknowledge the mistake, authorities chose silence. The investigation stalled. Leads dried up. Officers retired or were reassigned. Files were boxed and archived. Officially, the case remained open, but in practice it was abandoned. The Hwasong murders became an unsolved mystery, a dark chapter that many wanted to forget. For the families of the victims, forgetting was impossible. Parents aged without answers. siblings built lives shadowed by loss. Each year on the anniversaries of the murders, some returned to the fields and roads where their loved ones had died. They placed flowers. They bowed. They asked the same questions into the same empty air. Who did this? Why were they never caught? Yoon Seong-yo spent 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Inside, he was stigmatized as a monster. Guards treated him with contempt. Other inmates attacked him. He repeatedly proclaimed his innocence, but no one listened. His appeals were denied. The confession he had been forced to give followed him like a curse. When he was finally released in 2009, he emerged into a world that had moved on without him. His youth was gone. His family life shattered. His name permanently linked to a crime he had not committed. There was no public apology. No compensation. Just quiet release and the expectation that he would disappear. Meanwhile, the true killer lived freely. For decades, he blended into ordinary life. He worked. He married. He raised children. He passed police officers on the street, stood among crowds, watched news reports about his own crimes. As technology advanced, as DNA databases expanded, as South Korea modernized its criminal justice system, the Hwasong killer remained untouched, protected by time and institutional failure. The case might have remained buried forever if not for a renewed cultural reckoning in the 2010s. Younger generations began questioning old convictions. Investigative journalists revisited cold cases. Human rights organizations scrutinized past abuses by law enforcement. And then, in 2019, a television drama reignited national interest in the Hwasong murders. Based loosely on the case, it reminded the public of the unresolved questions and the lives destroyed not only by the killer, but by the system meant to stop him. That renewed attention prompted police to re-examine old evidence using modern forensic techniques. Among the preserved materials were items that had been considered useless decades earlier: clothing, ropes, and biological traces too degraded for analysis at the time. With advancements in DNA technology, those traces were tested again. What they found would change everything. In multiple cases, DNA extracted from preserved evidence matched the same unidentified male. This confirmed what many had long suspected. All of the murders had been committed by one person, a serial killer. And now, for the first time, science had given him a genetic fingerprint. That fingerprint was run through national databases. At first, there was no match. Then, unexpectedly, there was. The DNA belonged to a man already in prison, serving a life sentence for the rape and murder of his sister-in-law committed in 1994. His name was Lee Chun-yi. Lee had lived in Hwasong during the time of the murders. He had been questioned by police in the late 1980s but dismissed as insignificant. For more than 30 years, he had been hiding in plain sight. When detectives visited Lee in prison in 2019, they did not know what to expect. They approached him cautiously, unsure whether he would deny everything or remain silent. Instead, after initial resistance, Lee began to speak. And when he did, the horror of Hwasong deepened beyond anything investigators had imagined. When Lee Chun-yi finally began to talk, it was not with the rage or bravado many expected. Instead, his voice was calm, almost detached, as though he were describing events that had happened to someone else. Detectives who sat across from him later described the experience as deeply unsettling. There was no visible remorse, no trembling hands, no emotional breaks, only a methodical recounting of violence that had haunted an entire nation for more than 3 decades. At first, Lee admitted only to the crimes that forensic evidence had already linked to him. But as interviews continued, his admissions expanded. One by one, he confessed to each of the Hwasong murders. Then he went further. He described additional sexual assaults that had never been connected to the case. He spoke about attempted murders, about victims who survived by chance. The scale of his criminal behavior grew with every session. By the end of the interrogations, Lee Chun-yi had confessed to murdering at least 14 women and sexually assaulting more than 30 others. Many of these crimes had never been solved. Some had never even been reported. Investigators realized that Hwasong had been only part of a much larger pattern of violence that stretched across years and regions. Lee described how he selected his victims. He targeted women who were alone, often returning from work at night. He preferred rural areas with limited lighting and few witnesses. Rainy evenings were ideal. The sound of rain masked footsteps and muffled screams. He carried rope or improvised bindings and strangled his victims with their own clothing or stockings. The ritualistic nature of his crimes revealed a chilling level of control and planning. Even more disturbing was how ordinary Lee's life appeared on the surface. During the years he was killing, Lee held steady jobs. He married. He had children. Neighbors described him as quiet and polite. Coworkers remembered him as unremarkable. No one suspected that the man standing beside them had committed some of the most brutal crimes in South Korean history. This duality forced the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. Monsters do not always look like monsters. As Lee's confessions became public, outrage erupted across the country. Anger was not directed solely at the killer, but at the institutions that had failed to stop him. The wrongful conviction of Yoon Seong-yo returned to the spotlight, now undeniable proof of systemic abuse. Citizens demanded to know how an innocent man could be imprisoned for 20 years while the real killer lived freely. Under mounting pressure, prosecutors officially acknowledged that Yoon had been wrongfully convicted. In 2019, his conviction was formally overturned. For the first time, the state admitted what Yoon had insisted for decades. His confession had been extracted through violence and coercion. The apology, when it came, felt hollow to many. 2 decades of a man's life had been erased. No apology could restore what had been taken. The families of the Hwasong victims reacted with a mix of relief and renewed grief. Some felt validation knowing the truth had finally been revealed. Others were overwhelmed by rage that justice had come so late. Parents who had waited decades for answers were now elderly. Some had died without ever knowing who had murdered their daughters. Closure, when delayed for so long, carried its own cruelty. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered how close police had come to Lee Chun-yi during the original investigation. He had been questioned multiple times. He had lived within walking distance of crime scenes. In one instance, police had even taken his blood sample, but due to technological limitations, it was never analyzed. Each revelation added another layer of institutional failure. Public discourse shifted toward accountability. Law enforcement practices from the 1980s and 1990s were re-examined in detail. Survivors of police abuse came forward with their own stories of coerced confessions and mistreatment. The Hwasong case became a symbol not only of violent crime, but of the dangers of unchecked authority and outdated investigative methods. Yet even as the truth emerged, a painful legal reality remained. Lee Chun-yi could not be tried for the Hwasong murders. Under South Korean law at the time, the statute of limitations for murder had expired in 2006. Although that law was later abolished, it could not be applied retroactively. Lee was already serving a life sentence for the 1994 murder, but for the Hwasong victims, there would be no trial, no sentencing, no formal judgment delivered in a courtroom. For many families, this felt like another betrayal. They had waited decades for justice, only to learn that the law itself now stood in the way. Lee could confess freely, knowing there would be no additional punishment. His words, though horrifying, carried no legal consequences for the crimes that had defined his legacy. Still, prosecutors pressed forward with public hearings, documenting Lee's confessions and officially closing each Hwasong case. The process was symbolic rather than punitive, but it mattered. Names were restored to victims. Truth replaced speculation. Lies were stripped away. As South Korea grappled with the implications, the Hwasong murders reshaped national conversations about crime, memory, and justice. The case influenced sweeping reforms, including the permanent abolition of statutes of limitations for murder and greater protections against coerced confessions. Forensic standards were tightened. Interrogation rooms were outfitted with cameras. Human rights oversight expanded, but reform did not erase the past. For Yoon Seong-yeol, freedom came too late. He struggled with trauma, poverty, and isolation. The stigma of his wrongful conviction lingered despite its reversal. He spoke publicly about his experience, his voice steady but heavy with loss. His life stood as a warning about what happens when truth is sacrificed for convenience. For the families, grief remained permanent. Birthdays went uncelebrated, futures never realized. The knowledge of who killed their loved ones did not bring them back. It only clarified the scale of what had been lost. And for the nation, the Hwasong murders became more than a crime story. They became a mirror, reflecting the consequences of fear, haste, and institutional failure. A reminder that justice delayed is not merely justice denied, but justice distorted. Yet one final reckoning still remained. Because even with confessions, overturned convictions, and legal reforms, the question lingered in the public consciousness. How does a society truly account for evil when the law can no longer punish it? That question would shape the legacy of the Hwasong murders for generations to come. The Hwasong murders did not end when Lee Chun-yi finished his confessions. In many ways, that moment marked the beginning of a deeper national reckoning, one that extended far beyond a single killer or a closed case. South Korea was forced to confront not only how such atrocities had occurred, but how easily the truth had been buried beneath fear, urgency, and institutional pride. In the years following the revelations, the country experienced a profound cultural shift in how it viewed crime, authority, and memory. The Hwasong case became a permanent reference point in discussions about criminal justice reform. Law schools dissected it. Police academies studied it as a warning. Documentaries, books, and films revisited the timeline again and again, each retelling reinforcing the same lesson. When systems prioritize quick answers over truth, the innocent suffer and the guilty walk free. The abolition of the statute of limitations for murder was one of the most tangible outcomes. Lawmakers cited Hwasong repeatedly during legislative debates, arguing that time should never protect those who commit the most irreversible crimes. Although this change could not affect Lee Chun-yi's past actions, it ensured that future victims would not be denied justice simply because years had passed. It was a law written in the shadow of failure. Interrogation practices also changed permanently. Video recording of questioning became standard. Confessions alone were no longer considered sufficient without corroborating evidence. The era of forced admissions, beatings, and psychological coercion was publicly condemned. Survivors of past abuses found validation in these reforms, though many acknowledged that recognition did not undo the harm they had endured. The story of Yoon Seong-yeol became inseparable from the Hwasong murders. His wrongful conviction symbolized the human cost of systemic failure. Compensation was awarded, but money could not replace the years he lost behind bars or the life he might have built. When he spoke about his ordeal, his words were quiet, stripped of anger, heavy with exhaustion. He had been young when he was arrested. He emerged middle-aged, carrying scars no courtroom ruling could erase. For the families of the victims, life moved forward in fragmented ways. Some chose public advocacy, determined that their daughters' names would not fade into footnotes. Others withdrew from the spotlight, exhausted by decades of reliving their trauma. There was no single path to healing. Grief does not follow timelines, and justice, when delayed, arrives distorted. Anniversaries of the murders continued to be observed. Flowers were laid. Names were spoken aloud. In Hwasong, the fields and roads that once carried whispers of fear became places of quiet remembrance. Time softened the edges of terror but never erased it. The land remembered, even when people tried to forget. Lee Chun-yi remains incarcerated, living out his life behind concrete walls. He will never stand trial for most of the crimes he admitted to. There will be no sentencing hearing, no victim impact statements delivered in his presence, no formal declaration of guilt read aloud for the Hwasong murders. For many, this remains the most unsettling truth of all. Justice, though partially restored, will always feel incomplete. Yet the story did not end in silence. The Hwasong murders reshaped South Korea's relationship with its own past. They forced a society that once trusted authority without question to demand transparency, accountability, and evidence. They taught a generation that progress must be built not on certainty, but on skepticism tempered by compassion. The victims are remembered not as symbols of fear, but as individuals whose lives mattered. Women who walked home from work, daughters with futures that were stolen. Their stories are now preserved not in police files but in collective memory. And perhaps that is the final legacy. Because while the law failed for decades, while justice arrived too late for many, the truth eventually surfaced. And in doing so, it changed a nation. It ensured that the silence which once protected a killer would never again be allowed to outweigh the voices of the innocent. The Hwasong murders stand as a warning etched into history, not only about the existence of evil, but about the consequences of ignoring it, mishandling it, or denying it. A reminder that justice must be patient but never blind, and that even after decades of darkness, truth has a way of demanding to be heard. Story 2. On a quiet spring evening in May 2014, the suburban calm of Long Island was shattered in a way no one could have imagined. The kind of neighborhood where children rode bikes until sunset, where porch lights flickered on at the same time each night, and where neighbors waved but rarely pried into one another's lives. It was the kind of place people moved to believing they were buying safety. That illusion would not survive the night. The Fowler family had lived on Oak Ridge Lane for nearly 12 years. To the outside world, they were ordinary, stable, unremarkable in the safest possible way. Daniel Fowler was 46 years old, a senior systems analyst for a mid-sized financial firm in Manhattan. He commuted every weekday on the early morning train, carrying the same leather briefcase he'd owned for nearly a decade. He was quiet, disciplined, and predictable, the kind of man whose absence would be noticed because routines would suddenly feel wrong. His wife, Melissa Fowler, 42, worked part-time as a pediatric physical therapist. She was known among parents for her patience and gentleness, the kind of professional who stayed late without billing extra, who remembered birthdays, who followed up weeks later just to check on progress. Friends described her as warm but reserved, deeply devoted to her children, protective without being controlling. They had 2 children. 15-year-old Emily, a high-achieving sophomore with a love for photography and an obsession with true crime podcasts, and 10-year-old Jacob, a quiet boy who preferred model trains to team sports and still slept with a nightlight. Their home was tidy but lived in. Shoes by the door, school projects on the kitchen counter, fridge magnets from places they'd visited as a family, Nothing about it suggested danger. That night, May 18th, was a Sunday. Daniel had grilled dinner in the backyard, burgers and corn, the smell lingering in the air long after the plates were cleared. Emily had retreated to her room to edit photos she'd taken earlier that day. Jacob fell asleep on the couch halfway through a movie. Melissa washed dishes while Daniel scrolled through emails, already bracing for the workweek ahead. At 9:47 p.m., the doorbell rang. Melissa hesitated. They weren't expecting anyone. Daniel stood up, peered through the sidelight window. A man stood on the porch, early 30s maybe, hooded sweatshirt, hands visible, posture casual. "He says his car broke down," Daniel said quietly. "Needs to use the phone." Melissa felt a flicker of unease but brushed it aside. Oak Ridge Lane wasn't the kind of place where strangers caused alarm. Daniel opened the door. That decision would unravel everything. The man moved fast. The gun appeared before Daniel could react. A single step forward, the barrel pressed against Daniel's chest. Another figure emerged from the side of the house, then another. 3 men in total. They moved like they'd rehearsed this moment. "Inside, now," the first man said. Daniel raised his hands instinctively, backing away. Melissa froze, dish towel slipping from her fingers onto the kitchen floor. Jacob stirred on the couch. Emily opened her bedroom door upstairs, confusion etched across her face. Within seconds, the Fowler home was no longer theirs. Daniel was struck first. A blow to the side of the head sent him crashing into the wall. He collapsed, disoriented, blood trickling down his temple. His hands were bound with zip ties, tight enough to bite into skin. Tape was wrapped around his mouth. Melissa was forced to sit on the dining room floor. Her phone was taken. Her wedding ring pulled from her finger. She was shaking, trying to keep her breathing quiet, trying not to scream. Emily was dragged downstairs by her arm, her camera clattering uselessly to the floor. Jacob was lifted from the couch, half awake, crying in confusion. "This is a robbery," one of the men said, his voice eerily calm. "If you do exactly what we say, everyone lives." It was a lie. They tied the children separately. Emily to a dining chair, Jacob to the base of the staircase. The men moved through the house with purpose, not frantic, not sloppy. They knew what they were looking for. They demanded passwords, bank details, where the safe was, how much cash was in the house. Daniel tried to speak through the tape. A boot slammed into his ribs. "Shut up." Time stretched. Minutes blurred into hours. At some point after midnight, one of the men left the house. Surveillance footage would later show him stopping at an ATM 3 blocks away, unsuccessfully attempting to withdraw cash using Daniel's card. Another camera would capture him at a convenience store, purchasing bottled water and gloves. Inside the house, something shifted. The men stopped pretending this was just about money. Melissa sensed it first. The way their voices changed. The way they lingered. The way one of them kept glancing at the staircase, then at Emily. Daniel, helpless on the floor, realized with sickening clarity that whatever these men had planned did not end with theft. Outside, the neighborhood slept. Porch lights glowed softly. A dog barked once, then fell silent. No one heard the cries that were muffled behind walls. No one saw the shadows moving inside the Fowler home. And as the night deepened, the line between survival and loss began to disappear. The house felt smaller as the night wore on. The air grew thick with fear, every sound amplified, every breath measured. Daniel lay on his side, wrists bound behind him, cheek pressed against the cold hardwood floor. Each shallow inhale sent pain shooting through his ribs. He tried to focus on counting his breaths, anything to stay conscious, anything to remain present for his family. Melissa sat rigid near the dining table, hands tied in front of her, ankles secured with duct tape. Her eyes never left her children. Emily's face had gone pale, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached. Jacob whimpered softly, exhaustion and terror blending into quiet sobs that tore through Melissa's chest. The men spoke to each other in low voices, sometimes laughing, sometimes arguing. Their words blurred together, but their movements told a clearer story. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't panicked. They had time, and they knew it. Shortly after 1:30 a.m., the man who seemed to be in charge, later identified as Thomas Keller, knelt in front of Daniel. He peeled the tape from Daniel's mouth slowly, deliberately. "Where's the rest of it?" Keller asked. "There is no rest," Daniel whispered. "You took everything." Keller smiled, a thin, empty expression. He stood and nodded toward one of the others. A fist collided with Daniel's jaw. The tape went back on. They moved Melissa next. Keller crouched in front of her, his voice calm, almost conversational. He asked about accounts Daniel might not have mentioned, about retirement funds, about insurance policies. When she shook her head, tears spilling freely, he sighed as though inconvenienced. Emily watched, powerless, her nails digging into her palms. She tried to catch her mother's eye, to communicate something, strength, love, reassurance, but the distance between them felt infinite. At around 2:45 a.m., Keller made a decision. He untied Melissa's ankles and pulled her to her feet. She stumbled, nearly falling, before one of the other men steadied her grip too tightly. "You're coming with us," Keller said. "We're going to get more money." Melissa shook her head violently. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't take me." Daniel thrashed against his restraints, muffled screams tearing from his throat. Keller leaned in close to Melissa's face. "If you don't come quietly, your kids will pay for it." She went quiet then. Her shoulders slumped, her resistance draining away. She kissed Emily's forehead quickly, whispered Jacob's name, told him she loved him. It was the last time she would touch them freely. They forced her into the family car. The vehicle pulled away from Oak Ridge Lane at 3:02 a.m., headlights disappearing into the darkness. Inside the house, Daniel and the children were left with the other two men. The silence that followed was worse than the chaos that came before. Emily tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Jacob called for his mother until his cries dissolved into hoarse silence. Daniel stared at the ceiling, helplessness crushing him in waves. Every instinct screamed to protect his family, and every instinct was rendered useless. Melissa was taken to 3 ATMs. Each withdrawal maxed out. Surveillance footage later showed her standing rigid beside Keller, eyes unfocused, hands shaking as she followed instructions. At one bank, she tried to catch the attention of a teller, her lips forming silent words, but Keller's hand tightened around her arm and the moment passed. At 4:18 a.m., Keller abandoned the car several blocks from the house. Melissa was forced back inside. The men were angry now. The money wasn't enough. Something inside them had shifted irreversibly. The pretense of robbery was gone, replaced by a darker intent that had been simmering all night. The children sensed it. Daniel felt it in the way Keller paced, in the way he checked his phone repeatedly, in the way he looked at the clock on the wall. As dawn approached, the house grew quieter, the world outside slowly waking. Birds began to stir. Somewhere down the street, a garbage truck rumbled past. Inside the Fowler home, the final hours were beginning. The clock on the microwave glowed 5:11 a.m. when Keller finally stopped pacing. Dawn pressed faint gray light against the windows, outlining the shape of a house that would never feel like a home again. The night had stretched longer than any of them expected, and with every passing minute the risk grew. Keller knew it. The others sensed it. Panic began to creep in, not loud or frantic, but cold and decisive. Daniel noticed the change immediately. The casual cruelty was gone. In its place was urgency. Keller whispered something to the man closest to him, then turned toward the children. Emily felt her stomach drop. She had been watching him all night, memorizing every movement, every expression, knowing instinctively that this moment mattered. "Take the girl upstairs," Keller said. Emily screamed. It tore from her chest before she could stop it. Jacob sobbed, calling her name, struggling against the tape cutting into his wrists. Daniel thrashed again, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, rage and terror exploding inside him. "Please," Daniel cried once the tape was torn away. "Take me instead." Yes. Keller didn't even look at him. Emily was dragged toward the stairs. She fought, kicking wildly, nails clawing at skin, but she was no match. Her screams echoed through the house until the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. Downstairs, time slowed to a crawl. Jacob's crying became hysterical, his small body shaking violently. One of the men struck him across the face to silence him. Daniel lunged forward, the chair tipping, his shoulder slamming into the floor. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't feel it. All he could hear was Emily's voice fading into nothing. Minutes passed, or hours. Daniel never knew which. When Keller returned, his face was expressionless. He wiped his hands on his jeans as if brushing off dirt. He avoided looking at Daniel. "Finish it," he said quietly. The words barely registered before chaos erupted again. Jacob was pulled from his spot and dragged toward the hallway. Daniel screamed until his throat burned raw, begging, threatening, promising anything. The sound of Jacob's cries followed him, growing weaker, then stopping altogether. The house went silent. Daniel lay there, broken, staring at the ceiling. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could feel his pulse racing against the tape binding his wrists. Every second he expected death to come for him too, almost welcomed it compared to the agony of surviving. Instead, the men turned on him again. They beat him methodically, not in rage but with purpose. Each strike felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. When it was over, Keller leaned down close to his face. "You live," he said, "so someone remembers." The front door closed at 6:02 a.m. The sound of their footsteps faded. The engine started. Tires rolled away from Oak Ridge Lane. Daniel lay motionless for several minutes, unsure if he was still alive. Smoke didn't fill the house. There was no fire, no dramatic end, just silence and devastation. Somehow he found the strength to move. He rolled onto his side, then onto his stomach, teeth gripping the tape until it tore. His wrists screamed as circulation returned. Inch by inch, breath by breath, he crawled toward the phone on the counter. When he finally dialed 911, his voice barely sounded human. "My family," he whispered. "Please, my family." Police arrived within minutes, lights flashing against the quiet suburban street. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, confusion turning to horror as officers rushed inside. They found Daniel collapsed near the kitchen, bloodied but alive. They found Emily upstairs. They found Jacob in the hallway. They found Melissa in the master bedroom. The house was sealed. The street closed. A community that had gone to sleep safe woke up changed forever. The investigation began immediately. Detectives worked through the house, documenting every detail. Surveillance footage from nearby streets showed the suspect's vehicle leaving just after dawn. ATM cameras confirmed the withdrawals. Cell phone records placed Keller and the others near the home hours before the invasion. Within 48 hours, arrests were made. Thomas Keller was captured in a motel 2 counties away, counting cash. The others were arrested separately, attempting to flee the state. None resisted. At trial, prosecutors laid out a timeline that stunned the courtroom. Text messages revealed planning days in advance. Internet searches showed maps, escape routes, and household layouts. This had never been about money alone. Daniel testified last. He spoke slowly, deliberately, every word carrying the weight of unbearable loss. He described his wife's kindness, his daughter's ambition, his son's laughter. He described the sounds he would never forget, the silence that followed. No one in the courtroom breathed. The verdicts were unanimous. Life sentences. No parole. As the men were led away, Daniel didn't look at them. His gaze rested on the empty seats beside him. The Fowler case would ignite national outrage. Questions flooded the media. How had Keller been free? Why were parole violations ignored? Why had warnings gone unanswered? Laws would change. Policies would be rewritten. Committees would be formed. But none of it would bring back what was lost. Daniel would leave the house on Oak Ridge Lane forever. He would move, start over, survive. He would speak at hearings, advocate for victims, push for reform. He would become a symbol of endurance. But every morning before the world woke up, he would remember the night that never ended. The trials ended, the sentences were handed down, and the courtroom emptied. But for Daniel Fowler, the story did not end with the closing of a case file. In many ways, it was only the beginning. In the months after the verdicts, Daniel lived in a fog of grief and obligation. There were interviews he declined and interviews he accepted, days when he could speak about his family and days when he could barely get out of bed. The house on Oak Ridge Lane was sold quietly, its rooms scrubbed of visible reminders, though no amount of renovation could erase what had happened there. New owners would eventually move in, unaware at first of the history beneath their feet, until the address itself began to feel heavy in the community's collective memory. The town held vigils. Candles lined sidewalks. Flowers covered the front steps of the old home for weeks. Emily's school dedicated a scholarship in her name. Jacob's elementary school planted a tree near the playground, its plaque simple and understated. Melissa's colleagues organized health awareness events in her honor, turning grief into purpose the only way they knew how. Daniel attended some of these gatherings, standing quietly at the edge, nodding in gratitude. Other times he stayed away. Healing, he learned, was not linear. Some days he felt strong, resolved to ensure that what happened to his family would not happen to anyone else. Other days he felt hollow, as if surviving had come at an unbearable cost. What he could not escape was the public reckoning that followed. Investigations into Keller's past revealed a trail of missed warnings, parole violations that had been documented but not acted upon, reports filed and forgotten, risk assessments marked moderate when they should have screamed imminent. The system that had promised to protect the public had failed in quiet, bureaucratic ways long before the violence ever reached Oak Ridge Lane. Legislative hearings followed. Daniel was asked to testify. The first time he sat before a panel of lawmakers, his hands shook. He spoke anyway. He described the phone call he never wanted to make, the silence that followed, the knowledge that the men who destroyed his family should never have been free. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse individual officers or agencies. He simply told the truth, and it was devastating enough. Media coverage intensified. Some praised him for his courage. Others criticized the system more harshly, demanding accountability. Advocacy groups took up the Fowler name, pushing for parole reform, mandatory supervision standards, and better interagency communication. Bills were drafted, amendments proposed, some passed, some stalled. Change, Daniel learned, was slow and imperfect. Still, it mattered. Years passed. Daniel moved to a smaller town, closer to extended family. He returned to work in a limited capacity, finding comfort in routine. He volunteered quietly, mentoring other victims navigating the aftermath of violent crime. He never claimed to have answers, only experience. He visited the cemetery often. Sometimes he spoke aloud. Sometimes he sat in silence. Grief softened with time, but it never disappeared. It simply learned to live alongside everything else. The Fowler case would later be taught in criminal justice courses, cited in reform debates, referenced whenever discussions turned to parole oversight and victim protection. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that behind every statistic was a family, a home, a life irrevocably changed. For the public, it became history. For Daniel, it remained personal. On the anniversary of the crime, he released a brief statement each year. He never named the men responsible. He named only Melissa, Emily, and Jacob. He spoke of who they were, not how they died. He refused to let violence define them, and in that refusal there was power. Because while the night on Oak Ridge Lane stole everything he loved, it did not take his voice. And through that voice, through quiet persistence and painful honesty, Daniel ensured that his family would not be remembered only for what was done to them, but for the change their lives inspired. In true crime, stories often end with arrests and sentences, with a sense of closure that feels neat and final. But real life is rarely so kind. Justice can punish, but it cannot restore. Systems can improve, but they cannot undo loss. What remains is memory. What remains is responsibility. What remains is the obligation to listen, to learn, and to protect. Because the cost of failure is never abstract. It has names. It has faces. And once it arrives, it is already too late. Story 3. It began as an ordinary autumn morning in October 2014, the kind of morning that carried no warning. The sky over the small city of Fairview, Pennsylvania, was pale and overcast, leaves clinging stubbornly to trees lining quiet residential streets. Neighbors went about their routines. Coffee brewed. School buses hissed to a stop and moved on again. Nothing about that day suggested it would later be remembered as the moment an entire community lost its sense of safety. At 9:42 a.m., a call came into the Fairview Police Department requesting a welfare check at a modest two-story home on Brookside Drive. The caller was a co-worker who said 41-year-old Rebecca Lawson had not shown up for work, something she had never done in her 12 years at the county administrative office. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her car was not in the office parking lot. At first, it sounded routine. The dispatcher logged it accordingly. 2 officers were sent out. They expected to knock, leave a note, maybe report back that Rebecca was sick or traveling unexpectedly. What they found instead would unfold into one of the most disturbing cases Fairview had ever seen. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was unnaturally quiet. No television noise, no music, no sounds of movement. The officers stepped cautiously, announcing themselves as they moved through the living room. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Shoes neatly lined by the door, family photos on the wall, a half-folded blanket draped over the couch. Then they reached the kitchen. A mug sat on the counter, cold coffee still inside. A lunch bag rested near the sink, packed but untouched. It was the kind of detail that made seasoned officers pause. People who planned to leave did not usually abandon these small routines. At the base of the stairs, one of the officers noticed something darker. A faint smear along the wall, easily missed in dim light. He leaned closer. It wasn't dirt. It was blood. Backup was called immediately. By the time detectives arrived, the house was sealed off, and the street was filling with patrol cars. The discovery upstairs confirmed what everyone feared. Rebecca Lawson was dead. So were her 2 children, 13-year-old Lucas and 9-year-old Emma. They had been killed sometime during the night. The brutality of the scene was difficult even for experienced investigators. There were signs of struggle, defensive wounds, evidence that at least one of the children had tried to run. The crime was not quick and it was not silent, and yet no one had heard a thing. Rebecca Lawson was the kind of person people described as dependable, reliable, the one who always remembered birthdays and packed extra snacks for soccer games. She had grown up in Fairview, graduated from the local high school, married her college sweetheart, and believed she would raise her family in the same town that had raised her. That dream had already begun to fracture years before her death. Her husband, Michael Lawson, had left the family home in 2011 after what friends described as a slow, painful unraveling of the marriage. Financial stress, long hours, arguments that grew sharper over time, eventually separation papers, then divorce. Michael moved into an apartment across town. Rebecca stayed in the house with the children. To outsiders, the split seemed civil enough. Shared custody, scheduled exchanges, school events attended separately but without obvious tension. But those closest to Rebecca knew there was more beneath the surface. She was afraid. In the months leading up to her death, Rebecca had confided in friends and coworkers about Michael's increasingly erratic behavior. Late-night messages, unannounced visits, arguments that escalated quickly. Apologies followed by accusations, promises followed by threats. She documented everything: emails, voicemails, text messages. She saved them all, storing copies on a flash drive she kept hidden in her desk drawer at work. She told one friend, only half joking, "If something happens to me, don't let anyone say they didn't know." Police would later learn that Rebecca had sought a protection order just 6 weeks before her death. The request was denied. The judge cited insufficient evidence of immediate danger. Michael Lawson had no criminal record, no history of violence that showed up on background checks. On paper, he looked like thousands of other divorced men struggling to rebuild their lives. But paper did not show obsession. The night of October 18, 2014, Michael had custody of the children. He was supposed to return them by 8:00 p.m. Rebecca texted at 8:15. No response. She called at 8:30, straight to voicemail. At 9:02 p.m. she sent a final message that would later be read aloud in court. "Please bring them home. We can talk later." Phone records showed Michael's phone went dark shortly after. Investigators reconstructed the timeline carefully. Surveillance footage from a gas station 2 miles from Brookside Drive showed Michael's car at 10:11 p.m. He purchased nothing. He simply sat in the parking lot for nearly 15 minutes, staring ahead before driving off. Neighbors reported hearing a loud noise around midnight, a door slamming, a car engine revving. At the time, no one called it in. In Fairview, noise complaints rarely turned into triple homicides. By morning, Michael Lawson was gone. An alert was issued statewide. His photo flooded news broadcasts. Police warned the public not to approach him. The children were initially listed as missing until the truth inside the house made that designation obsolete. The community reeled. Schools closed early. Parents lined up to pick up their children, fear written openly on their faces. Churches opened their doors. Counselors were brought in. Reporters descended on Brookside Drive. Cameras pointed toward a house that now represented every parent's worst nightmare. For detectives, there was no mystery about who they were looking for. The question was how far Michael Lawson was willing to go, and whether he intended to survive what he had done. By the end of the day, a credit card ping placed him in Ohio. Then the trail went cold. As Fairview mourned, investigators prepared for what they feared would be the next phase of the case. A man with nothing left to lose, a country full of highways, and a history of warning signs that once again had not been enough to stop the violence before it began. And this was only the beginning. By the second night, Fairview felt hollowed out. Porch lights stayed on until morning. People double-checked locks they had ignored for years. Parents slept on bedroom floors beside their children, listening for sounds that had always been there but now felt unfamiliar. The Lawson house sat dark behind police tape, a still frame of a life interrupted, while detectives worked in rotating shifts, refusing to let the trail grow cold. Michael Lawson's name was now everywhere. His face stared back from television screens in grocery stores and gas stations across 3 states. Old coworkers were interviewed. Friends from college resurfaced. Even distant acquaintances were contacted. Anyone who might offer a hint of where a man goes when he decides not to be found. What emerged was not a monster in the traditional sense. It was something more unsettling. Michael had been quiet, intelligent, intensely private. He worked as a systems analyst for a regional logistics firm, a job that paid well and rewarded precision. He wasn't known for drinking heavily or frequenting bars. He didn't gamble. He didn't have obvious vices. What he had, investigators would later learn, was a consuming need for control, one that grew stronger as everything else in his life slipped beyond his reach. Phone records showed that after leaving Fairview, Michael headed west, then south, then west again, moving in erratic patterns that suggested intention rather than panic. He paid cash for gas after the first day. He stopped using credit cards altogether. Surveillance footage caught him in fragments, a reflection in a convenience store window in rural Ohio, a blurred image crossing a highway toll booth in Indiana, a partial license plate captured by a traffic camera near the Illinois border. Each sighting arrived too late. Investigators began building a psychological profile as quickly as they built the physical one. Michael wasn't running blindly. He was thinking, planning, adjusting. This wasn't a man fleeing in fear. It was a man who believed he had been wronged and was determined to define the ending on his own terms. Rebecca's flash drive became central to the case. Detectives retrieved it from her office desk after a coworker remembered her mentioning it months earlier. Inside were hundreds of files, emails stretching back over 2 years, voicemails saved as audio clips, screenshots of text messages that grew increasingly erratic over time. At first, the messages were apologetic, then accusatory, then threatening. "If I can't have my family, no one will." That sentence appeared more than once. Rebecca had taken the messages to the police. The report existed. The intake officer remembered her, calm, composed, determined. The problem wasn't that she hadn't spoken up. The problem was that the system she trusted had required her fear to meet a standard it could never quite reach until it was too late. As the evidence mounted, public outrage followed. News commentators questioned how a protection order could be denied in the face of such documentation. Experts debated the legal threshold for intervention. Victim advocates pointed out what they had been saying for years, that patterns of coercive control often escalate invisibly, dismissed as marital conflict until they turn lethal. For Michael, none of that mattered anymore. On the 4th day, a break came from an unexpected place. A clerk at a small hardware store in Missouri called in a tip after recognizing Michael's face from a flyer taped near the register. He had purchased rope, gloves, and a tarp. He paid in cash. He had asked for directions to a state park less than an hour away. Police moved quickly, coordinating with state troopers and park rangers. Search teams swept the area, helicopters scanning from above. They found Michael's car abandoned in a gravel lot near a trailhead. The doors were unlocked. The keys were gone. Inside the vehicle, they found a notebook. It was filled with writing, some of it incoherent, some of it chillingly clear. Michael wrote about betrayal, about being erased, about how Rebecca had turned the children against him. He wrote about fairness, about consequences, about endings that felt balanced. There were no apologies, no expressions of doubt, only justification. A manhunt began in earnest. The park was vast, thick with wooded ravines and uneven terrain. Weather conditions worsened overnight, rain soaking the ground, erasing footprints and complicating searches. Teams moved cautiously, aware that Michael could be armed, that he might be watching from somewhere unseen. Meanwhile, Fairview waited. Vigils continued, but now they carried an undercurrent of anger. People demanded answers, accountability, assurances that this wouldn't happen again. The Lawson Children's School counselors reported an overwhelming number of students requesting to talk. The ripple effect of the crime spread far beyond one household. On the 7th day, just before sunrise, a park ranger spotted movement near a remote cabin used seasonally by forestry workers. The structure hadn't been occupied in months. As law enforcement approached, they heard shouting, then silence. When they entered, they found Michael Lawson alive. He did not resist arrest. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, hands resting calmly on his knees. He looked thinner, older. His eyes were hollow but focused. When officers read him his rights, he nodded, as if this was simply another step he had anticipated all along. He asked only one question: "Are they talking about me yet?" Extradition happened quickly. The drive back to Pennsylvania was long and quiet. Michael stared out the window for most of it, watching landscapes blur together, the world continuing on without him. In Fairview, the announcement of his capture brought relief but not closure. That would come later if it came at all, because the next phase of the story was about to begin, and it would force an entire courtroom and eventually an entire nation to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the warning signs are loud, and sometimes they are ignored. Michael Lawson's return to Fairview did not feel like a homecoming. It felt like an invasion. Police cruisers lined the streets near the courthouse, lights flashing silently, a show of presence meant to deter anyone from acting on the rage that had been building for days. Reporters arrived before dawn, staking out sidewalks with cameras and microphones, waiting for the first glimpse of the man whose actions had fractured an entire town. When Michael was led inside, heads turned instinctively. He did not look like the image people had constructed in their minds. There was no wildness in his eyes, no visible tremor in his hands. He walked steadily, shoulders straight, as if stepping into a meeting rather than a preliminary hearing for the murder of his wife and children. That calm unsettled people more than any outburst could have. The prosecution moved swiftly. Charges were filed within hours. 3 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, and evidence tampering. The district attorney made it clear from the start that the state would seek life imprisonment without parole. There would be no shortcuts, no plea bargains whispered in back rooms. This case, they said, would be seen through to the end. Michael requested a public defender at first, claiming his assets were frozen. Later, when it became clear that he still had access to funds through a complex web of accounts, he hired a private attorney known for handling high-profile cases. The move sparked outrage, but legally it was unremarkable. Justice, as always, moved forward without regard for public sentiment. As weeks passed, the narrative deepened. Investigators began reconstructing the final months of the Lawson marriage in painstaking detail. Friends who had once described the couple as quiet and reserved now recalled moments that felt different in hindsight. Michael correcting Rebecca in public. Michael insisting on knowing where she was at all times. Michael showing up unannounced at her workplace under the guise of concern. None of it had seemed dramatic enough to raise alarms then. Financial records revealed further fractures. Michael had secretly taken out loans against shared assets, funneling money into accounts Rebecca didn't know existed. When she discovered the discrepancies and confronted him, the arguments intensified. Emails showed her demanding transparency, threatening separation if he didn't comply. His responses grew colder, more detached, as if he had already begun emotionally preparing for a future without her. The children's school journals became part of the evidence as well. Teachers had encouraged students to write weekly reflections. In one entry, their son mentioned that Daddy gets very quiet sometimes, and that Mommy cries in the car but says it's allergies. These lines were read aloud in court months later, and even the most seasoned courtroom staff struggled to maintain composure. Michael listened without visible reaction. Psychological evaluations painted a complex picture. Experts testified that Michael did not suffer from psychosis or a break from reality. He understood right from wrong. He understood consequences. What he struggled with was perceived humiliation. Loss of authority. The idea that his carefully constructed life could be dismantled without his consent. To him, control was not just a preference. It was an identity. The defense attempted to reframe the narrative. They argued that Michael had been emotionally overwhelmed, pushed beyond his limits by marital conflict and fear of losing access to his children. They spoke of stress, of desperation, of a moment where reason collapsed under pressure. It was a familiar strategy, one that relied on the hope that a jury might see tragedy where the prosecution saw intent. The prosecution countered with timelines. They showed how Michael had researched remote locations weeks before the murders, how he had purchased supplies in advance, how he had disabled tracking on his phone before taking the children, how he had sent Rebecca a text that morning pretending everything was normal, ensuring she let her guard down. This was not a snap decision. This was a plan. One of the most devastating moments of the trial came when the forensic pathologist described the crime scene in detail. The house, the order of events, the children's rooms. The prosecution did not sensationalize it, but the facts themselves were unbearable. Jurors looked away. One excused herself briefly, unable to continue listening without breaking down. Michael stared straight ahead. When it was time for him to speak, he declined. He did not testify. His attorney advised against it, warning that his demeanor might do more harm than good. Instead, a statement was read on his behalf, expressing remorse for the pain caused, without acknowledging responsibility. The words felt hollow, and the courtroom knew it. Outside, public discourse shifted from shock to reckoning. Advocacy groups held forums. Survivors of domestic abuse shared stories eerily similar to Rebecca's. Lawmakers cited the case while proposing changes to restraining order laws, arguing that patterns of coercive control should carry more weight than isolated incidents. Rebecca's parents attended every day of the trial. They sat together, holding hands, their faces marked by exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. They did not cry openly. They did not react when Michael entered or exited the room. Their grief was quiet, contained, and immeasurable. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. It took less than 9 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent enough to hear breathing. The foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly, and read the verdicts one by one. Guilty, on all counts. Michael did not react. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the outcome was inevitable. Life without parole. A permanent removal from the society he believed had betrayed him. Yet even as the legal chapter neared its end, the emotional one did not. For Fairview, for Rebecca's family, for the children's classmates who still set an extra place during imaginary games, the story refused to close neatly. And for Michael Lawson, the moment of reckoning had arrived. But reckoning, as it turns out, does not always look like regret. Sentencing day arrived without ceremony, but the weight of it pressed down on everyone who entered the courthouse. There were no protests outside this time, no shouted accusations or television crews jostling for position. The spectacle had faded. What remained was something heavier and quieter, a collective understanding that nothing said inside that room could undo what had already been done. Michael Lawson was brought in first. He wore the same neutral expression he had carried throughout the trial, his face unchanged by the knowledge that his future would be decided in minutes rather than years. He took his seat beside his attorney, hands folded, eyes forward. He did not look toward the gallery where Rebecca's parents sat, nor toward the row where extended family members and a few close friends had gathered. It was as if the rest of the room did not exist. The judge entered and the room rose. When everyone was seated again, the prosecutor spoke first. There was no grandstanding, no emotional flourish. Instead, the state methodically recounted the facts already proven beyond any reasonable doubt. The planning, the deception, the deliberate choices made at every step. The prosecutor spoke of Rebecca not as a victim but as a person, a daughter, a mother, a woman who had trusted the man who ended her life. The children were named, their ages spoken aloud, their personalities briefly described, not to inflame the court, but to restore their humanity after months of being reduced to evidence. When it was time for victim impact statements, Rebecca's mother stood. Her voice was steady at first. She spoke about the day Rebecca was born, about the way she used to hum absent-mindedly while cooking, about how motherhood had softened and strengthened her at the same time. She spoke about the children's laughter, the chaos they brought into family gatherings, the way the house felt too quiet now. She did not address Michael directly. She did not need to. Rebecca's father followed. His words were fewer but no less devastating. He spoke of promises broken, of trust violated in its most absolute form. He spoke of the burden of living with unanswered questions, of waking each day knowing that his grandchildren's futures had been stolen before they ever had a chance to unfold. Throughout it all, Michael remained still. When the defense was given an opportunity to speak, they reiterated their earlier arguments, asking the court to consider mental strain, emotional collapse, and the absence of prior violent convictions. It was a formality more than a plea. Everyone in the room understood that no sentence could ever feel proportionate to the loss. Finally, the judge spoke. She addressed Michael directly for the first time. She spoke of responsibility, of choice, of the difference between hardship and cruelty. She rejected the notion that stress or fear could excuse premeditated violence. She spoke of the irreversible harm done, not only to Rebecca and the children, but to the broader community that would carry the trauma forward for generations. Then she pronounced the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no reaction from Michael, no visible change, no acknowledgement. The gavel fell, and with it, the legal process ended. But for everyone else, the aftermath was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Fairview tried to move on, though moving on felt like the wrong phrase. The Lawson house remained empty for months, its windows dark, its presence a silent reminder of what had happened inside. Eventually it was sold, renovated, and repainted, though neighbors noted that no amount of fresh paint could erase the memory tied to the address. The schools held counseling sessions. Children asked questions adults struggled to answer. Why would someone hurt their own family? How could they have known? Teachers did their best, emphasizing safety, empathy, and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. Rebecca's parents retreated from public view. They focused on surviving one day at a time, leaning on routines, on familiar rituals, on the small comfort of shared memories. On anniversaries, they visited the cemetery together, bringing flowers and sitting in silence. Words felt inadequate there. Advocacy groups, however, did not let the case fade quietly. Rebecca's story became a reference point in discussions about domestic violence, coercive control, and the warning signs that often go unnoticed. Experts spoke about how abuse does not always leave bruises, how control can masquerade as concern, how danger often escalates when someone tries to leave. New training programs were introduced for educators and healthcare workers. Law enforcement agencies reviewed protocols for responding to domestic disputes. Legislators cited the Lawson case while debating reforms, arguing that patterns of behavior should be taken seriously long before violence erupts. Michael Lawson was transferred to a maximum security facility several states away. There were no interviews, no public statements. He disappeared into the system, another inmate with a long sentence and a past he could never escape. His name would occasionally resurface in academic discussions or legal analyses, but otherwise he faded from public consciousness. Rebecca and the children did not. A foundation was established in their names, focused on supporting families experiencing domestic abuse and providing resources for early intervention. Scholarships were created. Awareness campaigns launched. Their names were spoken not in relation to how they died, but in recognition of what their lives had come to represent. True crime often seeks resolution in verdicts and sentences, in the idea that justice brings closure. But closure is a myth. What exists instead is adaptation, learning to live with absence, learning to carry grief without letting it consume everything else. The Lawson case stands as a reminder of how fragile normalcy can be, how danger can hide behind familiar faces and quiet routines. It underscores the cost of ignoring warning signs, of minimizing control, of assuming that violence always announces itself loudly. It does not. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it plans. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary life until the moment it destroys everything. And long after the courtroom empties and the headlines fade, the real consequences remain, carried by those left behind, shaping lives in ways no sentence can ever undo. Story 4. On an ordinary autumn morning in October 2014, the town of Brookfield, Colorado, woke up believing it was just another quiet weekday. The sun rose over manicured lawns and neatly parked cars, and neighbors went about their routines without suspicion. Parents packed lunches, commuters checked traffic, children waited for school buses. Nothing about the day hinted that by nightfall, Brookfield would become the focus of a national manhunt and one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in recent American history. At the center of that day was the Harris family. From the outside, they appeared unremarkable in the way suburban families often do. Thomas Harris was 41 years old, employed as a mid-level project manager for a regional construction firm. He was reliable, punctual, and largely invisible. Coworkers described him as quiet but competent, a man who rarely spoke about his personal life and never caused problems. His wife, Laura Harris, 38, was a part-time dental hygienist and full-time mother. She volunteered at the local elementary school, helped organize community fundraisers, and maintained a modest but active social circle of other parents in the neighborhood. They had 2 children. Ethan, 9, was energetic and curious, known for asking endless questions and taking apart household objects just to see how they worked. Grace, 6, was shy, artistic, and inseparable from her mother. The family lived in a 2-story home on Willow Creek Drive, a cul-de-sac lined with trees that turned brilliant shades of orange and red every fall. To those who knew them casually, the Harris family was stable, predictable, normal. But normal, as it so often turns out, can be a carefully maintained illusion. In the months leading up to October, cracks had begun to form beneath the surface. Thomas had been under increasing pressure at work. A major project had gone over budget, and while he wasn't solely responsible, he feared being made a scapegoat. Emails recovered later would show late-night correspondence filled with anxiety about job security and finances. At home, Laura noticed changes in him that she struggled to articulate. He was more withdrawn, more irritable, prone to long silences that stretched uncomfortably between them. Arguments became more frequent, though never loud enough for neighbors to hear. Money was a recurring topic. Laura had discovered that Thomas had taken out a line of credit without telling her. When confronted, he brushed it off as temporary, a necessary measure until work stabilized. She didn't believe him, but she wanted to. For the sake of the children, for the sake of the life they had built, she chose reassurance over confrontation. By early October, Laura had begun confiding in a close friend. She spoke cautiously, as if afraid to name what she was feeling. She mentioned tension, emotional distance, a sense that Thomas was slipping away from her. She also mentioned something else, something that stuck with her friend long after. She said that Thomas seemed obsessed with the idea of starting over, though he never explained what that meant. On the evening of October 17th, the Harris family attended a school event. Photos from that night show them standing together, smiling stiffly, the children unaware of anything amiss. Thomas's arm is around Laura's shoulder, his expression neutral, almost distant. It would later become one of the last images of the family together. The following morning, Saturday, October 18th, began quietly. Laura took Grace to a birthday party across town. Ethan stayed home with Thomas, working on a science project for school. Neighbors would later recall seeing Thomas in the driveway, helping his son carry materials inside. Nothing seemed unusual. No raised voices. No visible tension. Just another father and son spending a Saturday morning together. By mid-afternoon, Laura returned home. What happened next would never be fully reconstructed with certainty, but investigators later pieced together a timeline based on forensic evidence, phone records, and digital footprints. At some point between 3:30 and 5:00 p.m., the violence began. The children were killed first. Ethan was in his bedroom. Grace was in the living room coloring. Laura was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The order of events suggested planning rather than impulse. There were no signs of a struggle downstairs. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. Whatever occurred, it happened quickly and with chilling control. By early evening, the house was silent. Thomas Harris left the scene shortly after. Surveillance footage from a gas station 10 miles away captured his vehicle just after 6:00 p.m. He appeared calm, purchasing fuel and snacks. He did not look like a man in crisis. He looked like someone running errands. When Laura's sister tried calling her that night and received no answer, she assumed the family was busy. It wasn't until the following morning, when calls went unanswered again, that concern turned into dread. By Sunday afternoon, after repeated attempts to reach anyone in the household failed, she drove to Willow Creek Drive herself. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Laura's purse sat on the kitchen counter. The television was off. Toys were scattered in the living room as if abandoned mid-play. It took only seconds for her to realize something was terribly wrong, and only moments longer for her to discover the truth waiting behind closed doors. She screamed. Neighbors called 911. Police arrived to a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Within hours, the Harris home was sealed off with yellow tape. Investigators moved in methodically, documenting every detail, every trace of evidence. The brutality of the crime stood in stark contrast to the ordinary setting. It was the kind of case that leaves officers shaken, the kind that forces professionals trained to compartmentalize to confront the limits of that training. By Sunday night, Thomas Harris was officially named a suspect, and he was nowhere to be found. As news broke, Brookfield descended into shock. Parents held their children closer. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Social media filled with disbelief, speculation, and fear. How could something like this happen here? How could someone destroy their own family without warning? What authorities did not yet know was that Thomas Harris was not simply running. He was following a plan. And the most dangerous part of the story was still unfolding. By the time Monday morning arrived, the quiet town of Brookfield had transformed into the center of an escalating manhunt. Patrol cars lined Willow Creek Drive. News vans crowded nearby intersections. Helicopters circled overhead, their steady thrum a constant reminder that the danger was not yet contained. Thomas Harris, a man who until days earlier had blended seamlessly into suburban life, was now the most wanted person in the state. Investigators worked through the night, reconstructing the crime scene piece by piece. The lack of forced entry confirmed what everyone already suspected. This was not an intruder. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was intimate violence carried out by someone the victims trusted completely. Someone who knew the layout of the house. Someone who knew where everyone would be at any given moment. Autopsies conducted later that day would confirm the brutality of the acts. Laura and the children had died within a narrow window of time. Toxicology reports showed no drugs or alcohol in their systems. There had been no attempt to sedate them. Whatever Thomas Harris had done, he had done it with full awareness, face to face with his family. As detectives combed through the home, they uncovered small but troubling details that hinted at premeditation. Laura's phone was missing. A family laptop had been wiped clean just days earlier. Financial records showed that Thomas had transferred nearly all available funds from their joint accounts into a private account in his name the week before the murders. He had also emptied a retirement fund, incurring steep penalties in the process. These were not the actions of a man acting in a sudden rage. These were the actions of someone preparing for an ending. At the Brookfield Police Department, a task force was assembled. State troopers joined local officers. The FBI was consulted due to the possibility that Harris had crossed state lines. A nationwide BOLO was issued with Thomas's photograph, vehicle description, and last known movements. Phone records provided the first significant lead. Thomas's cell phone had been powered on intermittently throughout Saturday night and early Sunday morning. Pings placed him moving west, away from Brookfield, toward the mountains. Then, at 2:17 a.m. Sunday, the phone went dark. Investigators believed this was intentional. They began searching rural areas, rest stops, and trailheads. Every abandoned vehicle became a potential crime scene. Every sighting reported by the public was followed up, even when it led nowhere. Tips flooded in. Some claimed to have seen Thomas at diners, gas stations, even hiking trails. Most were false. Fear has a way of making people see what they expect to see. As the search expanded, journalists began digging into Thomas Harris's past. Former coworkers were interviewed. Old classmates were tracked down. Neighbors were asked again and again if they had noticed warning signs. Many said no. Some hesitated, then mentioned things that now felt ominous in hindsight. His withdrawn nature, his fixation on finances, his occasional comments about feeling trapped, unappreciated, invisible. A former coworker recalled a conversation from weeks before the murders. Thomas had joked darkly about how people only mattered when they were gone. At the time, it had seemed like gallows humor. Now it felt like a confession disguised as a throwaway line. Laura's friends painted a different picture. They described a woman increasingly anxious about her marriage, but determined to protect her children at all costs. Text messages recovered from her phone showed she had been researching marriage counseling and legal advice. In one message sent just days before her death, she wrote, "I don't recognize him anymore, but I still believe there's good in him." That belief would cost her everything. By Tuesday, the case had captured national attention. Headlines referred to the Harris murders as another example of a growing phenomenon. Family annihilation, a type of crime that experts say often follows patterns of control, financial desperation, and perceived loss of identity. Psychologists weighed in on cable news, dissecting Thomas Harris's possible motives without ever having met him. But while analysts debated theory, investigators focused on reality. And the reality was that Thomas Harris was still out there. On Wednesday afternoon, a break finally came. A park ranger in western Colorado reported finding a vehicle matching the description of Thomas's car, abandoned near a remote trailhead bordering a national forest. Inside the vehicle were empty food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and a handwritten note. The note was brief, disjointed, rambling. "I tried to fix it," it read. "I tried to make it right. There was no other way." There was no apology, no explanation, no indication of where he had gone next. Search teams flooded the area. Dogs were brought in. Drones scanned the terrain. The forest was vast, rugged, and unforgiving. Night temperatures dropped below freezing. If Thomas was still alive, survival would not be easy. As the search stretched into days, public concern grew. Schools in nearby towns increased security. Outdoor events were canceled. Parents were warned to stay vigilant. The idea that a man capable of killing his own family might be hiding in the wilderness unsettled even those far removed from Brookfield. Behind closed doors, investigators faced a grim possibility. Thomas Harris might never be found alive. The note suggested despair. The location suggested intent. And yet there was no body, no definitive ending. Meanwhile, preparations were underway for 3 funerals. The community rallied around Laura's family. Candlelight vigils were held. Stuffed animals and handwritten notes piled up outside the Harris home. Children from Ethan and Grace's school wrote letters and drew pictures, trying to process a loss they could not understand. At one vigil, a neighbor spoke through tears. "We keep asking how this could happen," she said. "But maybe the real question is how we didn't see it coming." As search teams pushed deeper into the forest, the case stood at a crossroads. Either Thomas Harris would be captured and forced to face what he had done, or he would vanish into death, taking his answers with him. And looming over everything was a question that haunted investigators and civilians alike. If Thomas Harris truly believed there was no other way, what had convinced him of that? The answer, buried in his final days and unraveling mind, was still waiting to be uncovered. By the end of the first week, hope began to thin. Search teams had covered miles of dense forest, ravines, and abandoned mining paths near the Colorado trailhead where Thomas Harris's car had been found. Thermal drones detected nothing. Cadaver dogs showed no clear alerts. Each passing day increased the likelihood that Harris had either escaped the area entirely or succeeded in ending his own life in a way that left little trace. Behind the scenes, investigators shifted strategy. Rather than focusing solely on where Thomas might have gone, they turned back to who he was in the final months of his life. Behavioral analysts from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit were brought in to construct a psychological profile. They reviewed his financial activity, digital footprint, work history, and personal communications, looking for patterns that might suggest not just motive, but future intent. What they found painted a picture far more disturbing than a man who simply snapped. Thomas Harris had been quietly dismantling his life for nearly a year. Emails recovered from his work account revealed mounting disciplinary actions, missed deadlines, client complaints, a demotion he had never told his wife about. In private messages to a former colleague, Thomas described feeling humiliated and expendable, convinced that younger employees were being groomed to replace him. At home, Laura had been unknowingly carrying the emotional weight of that decline. Texts between her and close friends showed she had taken on more responsibilities, both financial and emotional, trying to keep the household stable. She had suggested therapy repeatedly. Thomas had refused, dismissing it as unnecessary and intrusive. His internet search history, recovered through warrants served on service providers, was even more telling. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Thomas had searched for phrases like life insurance exclusions, family debt after death, and what happens to assets if entire family dies. He had also visited online forums discussing disappearance, wilderness survival, and suicide methods. Yet interwoven among these searches were moments of apparent contradiction. He had looked up school events for his children's scheduled months in the future. He had bookmarked vacation rentals. He had even searched for anniversary gift ideas. To the analysts, this suggested internal conflict, not impulsivity but vacillation, a man oscillating between preservation and annihilation. Laura's phone, which had been missing from the house, was eventually located through GPS data. It had been discarded along a rural highway nearly 40 miles from the Harris home. The phone had been powered off manually. Before it was shut down, One unsent draft message remained. It read simply, "If anything happens to me, it was not an accident." That message would become one of the most haunting artifacts of the case. As investigators pieced together the timeline of the final night, a clearer picture emerged. Neighbor security cameras captured Thomas's car arriving home at 9:42 p.m. Laura's vehicle was already in the driveway. Lights went off by 10:30 p.m. There were no signs of struggle. No raised voices reported. Experts believe Thomas waited until everyone was asleep. What happened inside the house during those hours would never be fully known, but forensic evidence suggested the children were killed first, Laura last. There were no defensive wounds on the children. Laura, however, had injuries consistent with awareness. She had known what was happening, if only briefly. The knowledge that Laura may have understood what was about to occur became a focal point of public outrage. Commentators questioned how a man could look into the eyes of the woman he married and still carry out such an act. Psychologists explained that in cases of family annihilation, perpetrators often see their family not as separate individuals, but as extensions of themselves. In their distorted logic, destroying them is framed as protection, mercy, or control. None of those explanations brought comfort. As the manhunt stalled, pressure mounted on law enforcement. Why had Thomas not been flagged earlier? Could intervention have prevented this? Friends revealed that Laura had confided fears but had stopped short of reporting Thomas as dangerous. There were no restraining orders. No prior domestic violence calls. Nothing that would have legally triggered intervention. The system, once again, had only reacted after it was too late. Then, on the 12th day after the murders, a new development changed everything. A hiker reported encountering a man matching Thomas Harris's description near a small mountain town over 100 miles from the abandoned vehicle. The man had been thin, disheveled, with a noticeable limp. He asked for directions to a bus station. When the hiker offered to call for help, the man declined and disappeared into the woods. Security footage from a nearby convenience store confirmed it. Grainy but unmistakable. Thomas Harris was alive. The footage showed him entering the store just after midnight. He avoided the camera, kept his head down, paid in cash, and left within 2 minutes. His face was gaunt, his beard unkempt. He looked less like a fugitive mastermind and more like someone unraveling. Authorities believed Harris was attempting to move east, possibly toward a city where anonymity would be easier. Bus terminals, shelters, and hospitals were alerted nationwide. His image flooded media outlets again. Public reaction shifted from fear to fury. How could he still be alive? Became a common refrain. Why does he get to keep breathing when his family does? Victims' advocates pointed out the uncomfortable truth. If Thomas Harris were found alive, he would be entitled to a trial, to legal representation, to due process. Rights his family would never have again. As the net tightened, Harris made one final mistake. Using a stolen phone, he accessed an email account he believed had been deleted months earlier. He sent a single message to an unsent draft address, possibly intending it as a confession, or perhaps as absolution. It read, "I didn't want them to suffer alone. I didn't want to be the only one left." The IP address was traced within minutes. Law enforcement converged on a derelict motel outside a mid-sized city. The building was scheduled for demolition. It was the kind of place no one asked questions, perfect for someone trying to disappear. At 3:18 a.m., officers surrounded the structure. Inside, Thomas Harris was found alone in a room stripped nearly bare. There was no weapon within reach, no resistance. When officers entered, he reportedly looked up and said only one thing: "I'm tired." He was taken into custody without incident. The arrest brought relief, but not closure. Because now, for the first time, Thomas Harris would have to explain himself. and whatever he said next would force a nation to confront not just his crimes, but the unsettling reality of how close ordinary lives can drift toward unimaginable horror. The arrest of Thomas Harris marked the end of the manhunt, but it did not bring peace. From the moment he was taken into custody, the weight of what he had done followed him into every room, every hallway, every silent moment under fluorescent lights. He was transported back across state lines under heavy guard, his appearance concealed from the public, but his name already etched into the collective consciousness of a nation horrified by the details of his crime. During the extradition process, Harris remained largely silent. He answered basic procedural questions but refused to speak about his family. When offered food, he declined. When offered a lawyer, he accepted without hesitation. There were no emotional outbursts, no visible remorse, no attempts to justify his actions. To the officers escorting him, he appeared emptied out, like someone who had already lived past the end of his own story. Back in Brookfield, the town prepared itself for a new phase of trauma. The house on Willow Creek Drive had been boarded up, but it remained a focal point. Flowers had withered, candles had melted into the pavement, yet people still stopped, stood quietly, and tried to reconcile the ordinary appearance of the home with the extraordinary violence that had occurred inside it. The legal process moved swiftly at first. Harris was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to financial fraud and unlawful transfer of assets. Prosecutors made it clear from the outset that they would pursue the harshest possible sentence. There was no ambiguity in their stance. This was not a case for leniency. At his arraignment, Harris appeared thinner than ever, his hands clasped loosely in front of him as he listened to the charges being read aloud. He did not look toward the gallery, where Laura's parents sat holding each other, nor toward the rows of reporters scribbling notes. When the judge asked if he understood the charges, Harris nodded once and said quietly, "Yes." The question of motive dominated the early hearings. Prosecutors laid out a narrative of control, financial desperation, and ego collapse. They argued that Harris, faced with professional failure and the perceived loss of authority within his family, chose annihilation over accountability. His actions, they said, were deliberate, calculated, and motivated by a desire to maintain control even in destruction. The defense offered a different framing. They did not deny the killings. Instead, they focused on Harris's mental state. Expert witnesses testified about severe depression, narcissistic injury, and dissociative thinking. They described a man who viewed himself as the axis around which his family's existence revolved, and who, when that axis fractured, believed the entire structure must fall with it. But even among mental health professionals, there was no consensus that Harris had been psychotic or incapable of understanding his actions. The planning, the financial transfers, the attempts to evade capture all pointed to awareness and intent. As the trial unfolded, details emerged that further unsettled the public. Investigators revealed that Harris had written multiple unsent letters on his computer in the weeks before the murders, some addressed to Laura, others to his children. None were finalized, none were sent. In one draft, he wrote that he loved them more than anything. In another, he accused them of needing too much, of expecting him to carry burdens no one else could see. One passage stood out. "If I fail, we all fail," he had written. "There is no version of this where I am the only one left." That sentence became emblematic of the case. It was quoted endlessly in media coverage, dissected by psychologists, debated by commentators. To some, it represented a warped attempt at protection. To others, it was the ultimate expression of selfishness. Testimony from Laura's friends painted a heartbreaking contrast. They spoke of a woman trying desperately to hold her family together while quietly preparing for the possibility that it might fall apart. She had researched divorce lawyers but had not contacted one. She had opened a separate savings account but had not funded it. She had confided fears but still hoped for reconciliation. She believed people could change. One friend testified through tears. She believed love was enough. The jury listened in silence. When it was time for sentencing, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Victim impact statements were read by Laura's parents, siblings, and extended family. They spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, of futures erased, of the unbearable knowledge that the person responsible had once been trusted completely. One statement, delivered by Laura's mother, left the courtroom in stunned quiet. "You didn't just kill my daughter and grandchildren," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "You killed every version of the future we were supposed to have." Thomas Harris was given the opportunity to speak. He stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly, and addressed the court. His words were brief. He said he was sorry. He said he wished he could take it back. He said he knew those words meant nothing now. He did not explain why. The judge, in delivering the sentence, made it clear that remorse after the fact could not outweigh the calculated destruction of innocent lives. Harris was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively. He would never leave prison. As he was led away, there was no outburst, no final glance at the gallery. The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed longer than anyone expected. In the months that followed, the community struggled to move forward. Counseling services were expanded. Schools implemented new mental health programs. Local lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at earlier intervention in domestic instability cases, particularly those involving financial control and emotional isolation. Yet for many, progress felt hollow. The Harris case joined a growing list of family annihilation crimes that forced uncomfortable conversations about how such tragedies can hide behind normalcy. Neighbors replayed memories. Friends questioned missed signs. Professionals debated thresholds for intervention. There were no easy answers. What remained was a cautionary truth. Violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly, fed by resentment, fear, and unchecked control, until it reaches a point where destruction feels inevitable to the person holding it inside. Laura, Ethan, and Grace Harris became more than victims. They became symbols of the cost of silence, of the danger of equating worth with control, of the catastrophic consequences when one person decides they have the right to end other lives. Their story is not just a true crime narrative. It is a warning, because behind closed doors, in homes that look just like any other, the line between ordinary struggle and irreversible tragedy can be thinner than anyone wants to believe. Story 5. On a cold January morning in 2014, the quiet town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, woke up to flashing police lights and the kind of silence that only follows something unspeakable. Snow clung to rooftops and tree branches, undisturbed except for the footprints of officers moving carefully around a modest two-story home on Maple Ridge Lane. Inside that house, a scene waited that would haunt investigators for years and fracture a community that believed it was immune to horror. By the end of the day, 4 members of one family would be dead, 1 man would be missing, and the question on everyone's lips would be the same. How could something like this happen here? Cedar Falls was the kind of place where people waved at strangers and left their doors unlocked. With a population just over 40,000, it was known for its university, tree-lined streets, and family-friendly neighborhoods. Crime existed, but it was mostly petty theft, the occasional bar fight, nothing that ever made national headlines. Maple Ridge Lane was especially unremarkable, a quiet residential street where children rode bicycles in summer and neighbors shoveled each other's driveways in winter. The Peterson family had lived there for nearly a decade. Mark Peterson was 46 years old, a civil engineer employed by a regional construction firm. He was known as reliable, meticulous, and reserved. His wife, Emily Peterson, 42, was a former elementary school teacher who had left her job to raise their children. Friends described her as warm, organized, and deeply devoted to her family. Together, they had 3 children. Daniel, 17, a high school senior with plans to attend Iowa State University. Lily, 12, bright and talkative, who loved art and horseback riding. And Noah, 8, the youngest, who adored dinosaurs and refused to go anywhere without his worn blue jacket. From the outside, the Petersons appeared to embody stability. Mark coached Daniel's youth baseball team when he was younger. Emily volunteered at school events and organized neighborhood potlucks. Their Christmas lights were always up early. Their lawn was always trimmed. There were no police calls to their address, no rumors of trouble, no visible cracks, but appearances can be deceptive. On January 14, 2014, at 8:17 a.m., Cedar Falls police received a call from Emily Peterson's sister, Rachel Monroe, who lived 2 hours away in Des Moines. Rachel reported that she had been unable to reach Emily for over 24 hours. Text messages had gone unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. Emily had failed to show up for a scheduled video call the previous evening, something she had never missed. Rachel's concern escalated when Daniel's school called her that morning, saying he had not shown up for classes and had not called in sick. Officers were dispatched to Maple Ridge Lane for a welfare check. When they arrived, nothing immediately appeared wrong. The Petersons' car was parked in the driveway. The front door was closed and locked. There were no signs of forced entry. Snow covered the walkway, undisturbed except for older footprints that appeared to be from the previous day. The house looked asleep. Repeated knocks went unanswered. After several minutes, officers contacted a supervisor and were given permission to enter the home. Using a key obtained from a neighbor who kept a spare for emergencies, they unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The warmth hit them first. The thermostat was set high, unusually so for a family conscious of heating bills. The second thing they noticed was the smell, faint but unmistakable, metallic, wrong. In the living room, nothing seemed out of place. The television was off. Toys were neatly arranged. A half-finished cup of coffee sat cold on the kitchen counter. It was as if time had stopped abruptly. The first body was found in the master bedroom. Emily Peterson lay on the bed, covers pulled neatly up to her chest. At first glance, she appeared to be sleeping. But closer inspection revealed bruising around her neck and a discoloration to her lips that immediately told investigators she was dead. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle in the room. The children were found upstairs. Daniel was in his bedroom, lying on his back, still wearing the clothes he had slept in. Lily was in her room, curled on her side, clutching a sketchbook. Noah was in his bed, his blue jacket draped over him like a blanket. All 3 children were deceased. There was no blood, no obvious trauma beyond subtle marks that suggested asphyxiation. The house was eerily clean, too clean. As officers moved through the home, a realization set in that made the scene even more disturbing. One person was missing. Mark Peterson was nowhere to be found. His wallet, phone, and laptop were gone. His car, a gray sedan, was not in the driveway. There was no note left behind, no explanation, only absence. By midday, the story had spread across Cedar Falls. Police tape cordoned off Maple Ridge Lane. News vans arrived. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering, crying, trying to understand how a family they had waved to just days earlier could be gone. The police initially released little information, confirming only that 4 people were dead and that they were searching for Mark Peterson. Privately, investigators were already forming a grim theory. This was not a random crime. There was no forced entry, no theft, no evidence of an intruder. Everything pointed inward. As forensic teams worked through the house, more unsettling details emerged. Toxicology reports would later show that Emily and the children had been sedated before their deaths. Prescription sleep medication had been crushed and mixed into food or drinks. The doses were high, especially for the children. Whoever administered them knew exactly what they were doing. The timeline suggested that the family had been killed sometime late on the night of January 12th or early morning January 13th. Neighbors reported no unusual noises, no screams, no disturbance. Snowfall overnight had covered any tracks outside. Investigators turned their attention to Mark Peterson's recent behavior. Coworkers were interviewed, friends were questioned, bank records were pulled. And slowly, a different picture began to form. In the months leading up to the murders, Mark had been under increasing pressure at work. A major construction project he had overseen was facing delays and cost overruns. Internal emails revealed that he had been warned his job was at risk. Financial records showed that the Petersons were deeper in debt than anyone realized. Credit cards were maxed out. The mortgage was behind. There were withdrawals from savings that Emily did not appear to know about. More troubling still were emails Mark had exchanged with a colleague just weeks earlier. In them, he expressed feelings of failure, of being trapped, of believing he was letting everyone down. In one message, he wrote, "I don't see a way out of this that doesn't destroy everything." At the time, no one had taken those words literally. By the evening of January 14th, Cedar Falls police issued a statewide alert for Mark Peterson. His photo was broadcast across news channels. His car description was circulated to every patrol unit in Iowa and neighboring states. Authorities stressed that he was a person of interest and urged the public not to approach him if seen. As the manhunt began, the nation watched, trying to make sense of a story that was only just beginning to unfold. Because what investigators would soon discover was that the Peterson family tragedy was not a spontaneous act of violence, but the final chapter of a carefully concealed collapse that had been building for years, hidden behind routines, smiles, and a life that looked perfect from the outside. And the road Mark Peterson was traveling on that winter night would lead to revelations far darker than anyone in Cedar Falls was prepared to confront. By the time investigators publicly named Mark Peterson as the prime suspect, the story had already taken on a life of its own. National news vans lined the frozen streets of Brookfield, Wisconsin, their satellite dishes angled toward the gray winter sky. Neighbors who had once waved casually now spoke in hushed tones, replaying every interaction they had ever had with the Peterson family, searching for missed signs that might explain the unthinkable. Inside the Peterson home, forensic teams worked methodically. The crime scene told a story that words could not soften. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no evidence of a struggle that suggested an outsider. Everything about the house pointed inward, toward someone who belonged there, someone who knew where everyone would be at that hour, someone who understood routines intimately. Autopsies confirmed what investigators had feared. The victims had been killed while they slept. The medical examiner noted the absence of defensive wounds, reinforcing the conclusion that they never had a chance to fight back. The method was precise, almost clinical, suggesting planning rather than impulse. This was not an act of sudden rage. It was a decision carried out deliberately. As details emerged, so did questions about Mark's mental state in the weeks leading up to the murders. Friends recalled him becoming increasingly withdrawn after losing his job at a regional logistics firm. He had been with the company for nearly 15 years, steadily climbing the ladder, until a sudden round of corporate restructuring eliminated his position. At first, Mark framed it as a temporary setback. He told people he was between opportunities, that something better was on the horizon, but privately, the pressure was crushing. Financial records revealed mounting debt. Credit cards maxed out. A second mortgage quietly taken against the house. Emails between Mark and his wife, Emily, showed growing tension. She urged transparency, suggesting they sit down together and reassess their budget, maybe even consider downsizing. Mark resisted. To him, admitting the severity of their situation felt like admitting failure, not just to his family but to himself. Investigators also uncovered a series of text messages Mark had sent to his brother in the weeks before the killings. They were vague but unsettling in hindsight. Messages about feeling cornered, about how some mistakes can't be fixed, about how he didn't know how to start over at this age. At the time, his brother had assumed Mark was simply venting. Now each word carried a heavier meaning. As the search expanded beyond Wisconsin, law enforcement agencies across the Midwest were placed on alert. Mark's photo circulated widely. Tips poured in. Some claimed to have seen him at gas stations, others at rest stops or cheap roadside motels. Most leads led nowhere, but each one demanded precious time and resources. Then came a breakthrough. On January 18th, a hiker in northern Illinois reported an abandoned vehicle near a forest preserve outside Rockford. The gray sedan matched the description of Mark Peterson's car. Inside, investigators found his wallet, his phone, and a folded piece of paper tucked into the glove compartment. The note was brief, handwritten, and deeply unsettling. It spoke of regret, of being sorry it had to end this way, and of believing there was no other option left. The discovery intensified fears that the manhunt was approaching its final chapter. Search teams combed the surrounding woods, battling freezing temperatures and heavy snow. Helicopters scanned from above. K-9 units traced scent trails that faded and reappeared unpredictably among the trees. Meanwhile, the nation watched as experts debated Mark's fate. Was he attempting to disappear, shedding his identity piece by piece? Or was the note a farewell, signaling an intention to die on his own terms? Investigators couldn't afford to assume either. Until Mark Peterson was found, alive or dead, the case remained dangerously open. Back in Brookfield, the Peterson home stood dark and silent. Flowers and handwritten notes covered the front lawn. Strangers gathered there, some praying, others simply staring at the house, struggling to reconcile the image of a quiet family man with the reality of what had occurred inside those walls. As the search pressed on, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever happened next, the damage was already irreversible. A family had been erased, a community shattered, and a question loomed that would haunt everyone involved long after the headlines faded. How does a life unravel so completely, and how many warning signs had been quietly ignored along the way? The search entered its third week under a growing cloud of uncertainty. Snowstorms swept across northern Illinois, erasing footprints, burying evidence, and complicating every effort to track Mark Peterson's movements. What had begun as a focused manhunt now stretched across jurisdictions, budgets, and emotional endurance. Investigators knew that time was no longer their ally. Behavioral analysts revisited the note found in Mark's car, scrutinizing every word, every pause in the handwriting. The language suggested finality but not clarity. There was no explicit goodbye, no instruction, no confession. Instead, it hovered in a liminal space, balanced between surrender and escape. Analysts warned against assuming suicide. Men like Mark, they explained, often vacillated between wanting to disappear and wanting to be found, between shame and control. New digital evidence added weight to that theory. Although Mark's phone had been left behind, his online presence had not gone completely dark. A financial forensics team uncovered an overseas wire transfer initiated just days before the murders, a modest but deliberate amount routed through a series of intermediary accounts. It wasn't enough to start a new life comfortably, but it was enough to survive for a short while. Enough to move. Investigators also discovered that Mark had renewed his passport 6 months earlier, despite having no documented travel plans. At the time, it had raised no alarms. Now it felt significant. Every detail that once seemed mundane now appeared charged with meaning. Tips continued to pour in, but one stood out. A clerk at a small motel outside Duluth, Minnesota, reported a guest who bore a striking resemblance to Mark. The man had paid in cash, avoided eye contact, and checked out early the next morning despite having paid for 2 nights. Surveillance footage showed a man wearing a baseball cap and heavy jacket, his face partially obscured, but his posture, height, and gait aligned closely with Mark's. The sighting reopened an unsettling possibility. If Mark was heading north, winter itself could become both his shield and his enemy. Vast stretches of wilderness offered anonymity, but survival required preparation. Investigators debated whether he was running towards something or simply running out of options. As law enforcement pushed forward, the emotional toll deepened for those left behind. Emily's parents, now caring for what remained of their daughter's life, spoke publicly for the first time. Standing before cameras, her mother described Emily not as a victim but as a presence. A woman who laughed easily, who worried constantly about her children, who believed that honesty, even when painful, was the only way forward. She wanted help, her mother said quietly. She believed problems could be solved if you faced them together. Those words resonated painfully with investigators who had spent weeks reconstructing a reality in which that belief was shattered. Behind the scenes, prosecutors began preparing for outcomes they hoped would never be needed. They assembled timelines, expert testimony, and psychological evaluations, not just to prove what happened, but to explain how it could have happened. Because even if Mark Peterson was never found, the case would not simply disappear. Families, communities, and courts would still demand answers. As February approached, search efforts slowed. Resources were reallocated. Leads dried up. The manhunt, once urgent and all-consuming, slipped into a quieter, more methodical phase. Mark Peterson became a name filed under active but unresolved, a status that carried its own quiet cruelty. Then, nearly 6 weeks after the murders, a park ranger in Ontario, Canada, made a discovery that would once again thrust the case into the national spotlight. Near a remote trailhead bordering a frozen lake, the ranger found a campsite that didn't belong. The gear was minimal but deliberate. A thermal blanket, empty food packaging, a notebook sealed in plastic. And beneath the snow, partially concealed, a man's jacket containing identification from the United States. The name inside was Mark Peterson. Authorities moved quickly, securing the area and notifying U.S. officials. But there was no body, no immediate sign of what had happened after Mark left that campsite. The lake nearby had begun to thaw unevenly, its surface a treacherous patchwork of ice and water. Once again, the case stood on the edge of resolution, staring into silence. Had Mark crossed the border seeking disappearance, or had he reached the end of the road? The answer, like so much else in this case, remained just out of reach. By early March, the case had evolved into a dual narrative, one of forensic reconstruction and another of myth and speculation. Authorities in both the U.S. and Canada coordinated quietly, exchanging intelligence about sightings, financial transactions, and patterns of movement. But the trail remained cold. The Ontario campsite had offered clues but no certainty. Mark Peterson had left behind items, but not enough to determine whether he intended to vanish permanently or whether tragedy had overtaken him in the unforgiving wilderness. Back home, the Peterson family and Emily's relatives faced the long, painful process of piecing together their lives from the fragments left behind. Counseling sessions, support groups, and community vigils became regular fixtures. Emily's Memorial Fund, originally created to honor her work with children with disabilities, shifted to include scholarships for young adults pursuing careers in social work and family counseling, a living testament to her commitment to helping others. Investigators returned to the digital trail, analyzing encrypted messages, financial accounts, and travel logs. Even minor patterns took on new significance. A rental car reservation abandoned, a hotel credit card charge disputed, a social media post that had been deleted but recovered through archive backups. Each breadcrumb suggested someone attempting to stay ahead of discovery, someone deeply aware of the consequences of being found. Experts in fugitive tracking emphasized that people like Mark, who had both intelligence and planning capacity, were highly capable of survival, but also prone to leaving patterns unavoidably behind. Months passed. As the seasons shifted, the focus broadened from search to analysis. Law enforcement agencies held multi-jurisdictional conferences, developing hypothetical scenarios about Mark's intentions, survival, and psychological state. Profilers suggested he might be living under a new identity, possibly aided by sympathetic contacts or cash acquired prior to fleeing. Others feared that exposure to the harsh winter landscape and lack of supplies might have ended his life quietly, leaving no trace. Meanwhile, public interest remained high. News articles and documentaries recounted the Peterson tragedy in exhaustive detail, blending factual reporting with reflection on social systems and criminal investigation procedures. Writers and analysts debated whether lessons had been learned about domestic violence, about intervention strategies, and about the limits of law enforcement reach in cases involving complex family dynamics and sophisticated evasion. Despite the months of uncertainty, investigators never stopped attempting to connect the final dots. They retraced routes northward, examined border crossings, and interviewed anyone who might have had contact with Mark. Occasionally, a tip reignited hope, a witness recalling a man matching his description buying supplies at a remote convenience store, or surveillance footage from a gas station across state lines showing a solitary traveler with characteristics consistent with his known profile. Each lead was meticulously verified, though none yielded definitive answers. By late summer, a consensus began to emerge within law enforcement. Mark Peterson's disappearance had become a permanent unresolved case, one where the factual record could document the crimes committed against Emily and her children, but where the perpetrator's ultimate fate remained unknown. The case file became both complete and incomplete, a detailed account of devastation, coupled with a gap where closure should have been. Still, the legacy of Emily Peterson and her family endured. Programs in her name continued, advocacy groups strengthened, and communities focused on preventive measures to reduce risks of domestic and familial violence. Emily's courage in reporting threats before the tragic events was cited in professional journals, emphasizing the critical need for early intervention and systemic support. Though Mark Peterson's trail went cold, the case influenced policy reforms and criminal justice discussions. Training for law enforcement officers now included updated modules on tracking fugitives who might cross borders and disappear, while social services improved protocols for supporting families at risk. Media coverage highlighted both the cautionary tale and the ways society could learn from tragedy to prevent future loss. In the end, the Peterson case remained a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the persistence of justice seekers, and the complex interplay of human behavior and circumstance. It was a story of unresolved questions, unhealed wounds, and a family whose tragedy catalyzed awareness and change. While the world may never know exactly what became of Mark Peterson, the lives he shattered and the impact of his actions continue to resonate, reinforcing the enduring need for vigilance, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious,